Chapter 10. There's a weird thing about explosions. No matter how much you know that the sound they make is a dull crump, followed by the whistling of debris and the clang of shattering glass, there's only one word which sums them up, really. Bang. This one was more of a bang, in fact, and the immediate aftermath was kind of intense. Zenda was thrown on top of me, and I ended up spread across the sofa all over Alkland, covered in pieces of masonry and flashing, blinking video wall. "Shit!" I shouted intelligently, and leaping up when it seemed safe, "Fuck!" I quickly checked Zenda, who was all right apart from a few scratches. "Stay with him. Shit, where's Spangle? Where's the cat?" I found him sitting dozily in the bedroom, looking mildly surprised but a lot more relaxed than what I felt. I ran back into the living room. Sparks from the annihilated video wall were arcing up and around the hole through to the kitchen, and I kicked the power unit out as I stepped through. The kitchen looked like, as if a bomb had hit it, actually. It was full of smoke, and small fires were burning in some of the corners. I stomped them out as best as I could, trying to avoid the splodges of red gunge all over the floor and walls. It was impossible to tell which was pizza and which wasn't. "Is she dead?" called Zenda. "Sort of," I shouted. "And the pizza's completely fucked too." Alkland looked appalled at this, until Zenda explained that the delivery girls are only pseudo-flesh droids. Pizza firms in some of the seedier neighbourhoods run a service where a pseudo-flesh pizza droid will come around, have sex with you, cook you a pizza and then leave, all for 20 credits. It was voted most tremendous concept ever for 4 years running in Chauve neighbourhood, and I know a few busy women who have the number programmed into their phone. I knelt in front of the remains of the new coven and peered cautiously into it. Deep in the mangled twist of metal and covered with vaporized tomato paste, I found what I was looking for. A small metallic cube with a flashing light on it. It was an impact device, which works like a bomb but is more controllable as it destroys by artificial shock waves and can be set for radius. Luckily, whoever had planted the bomb had left it at room dispersal intensity, assuming that that would be enough. I didn't need the bug Annalie to tell me what the flashing light meant. It was transmitting completion of its mission back to base, and transmitting by shock sound displacement. You can't screen against that. "Fuck," I said again, and hurried out into the living room. "We have to get out of here, now." "Why?" "Because any minute now we're going to have some visitors." Suddenly, with complete and utter clarity, I realised what it was that had tickled the back of my mind on the roof of stable, the disquieting thought that I'd forgotten about. And I realised what it meant. I ran around the living room, grabbing a few bits and pieces while Zenda gently helped Alkland to his feet. I dashed into the bedroom, picked up Spangle, and then hurried everyone out into the hallway where the fire warning lights were flashing. "Okay," I said. "Zenda, you have to get the hell back to the centre. Take Spangle with you and be very, very careful." "What's going on?" "Alkland was right," I said, shepherding them into the elevator and shooting it down towards the ground. "These guys are deadly serious. When I called you, when I was trying to get into stable, I'd just been shot at. I thought it was one of the gang that had got Alkland, but of course there was no gang." The floor lights zipped past, and I willed the elevator to go faster as I handed Spangle over to Zenda. "Who was it then?" "Who knew I was going in? You, G, Sned, and the centre. C, Darv, and however many lunatics they have on their side. They tried to kill me yesterday, before I'd even got to Alkland." "The centre don't try and kill people. Well, they do now. The elevator crashed to a halt at ground, and I pushed the two of them out in front of me, and then took a second to send the elevator back up to the top floor. We hit the street at a run. A couple of twists and turns brought us out onto Purple 34, which is a side street of Mauve, one of Colour's main drags. I slowed to a fast walk, and we headed up towards the intersection, keeping close to the wall. When we were 20 yards away, I stopped. Okay, this is where we split. Zenda, go. Take a right up Mauve. Hue 1 mono station is about a block and a half. Keep your head down and walk at a normal pace. And you, I said, bending forward to rub Spangle's nose, keep looking after her. Zenda hesitated and then darted forward to peck me on the cheek. Good luck, she said to Auckland. She looked me straight in the eyes for a moment, and then she was gone. I grabbed the actioneer's arm and led him down the alley which cut across to 35. Isn't this the way we came? He panted. Yeah, chase psychology for beginners. Head down, but keeping care to keep our speed near normal, we crossed the road. We'd only just reached the other side when two open-top air cars whipped into the street, taking the corner virtually on their sides. I pulled Auckland gently back and we melted into the shadows. The cars slammed to an instantaneous halt outside the apartment building. Too instantaneous, in fact. One of the passengers was nearly thrown clear of the car. Two men got out of each car and ran into the building. They all carried guns, and as they entered the lobby I caught the smallest flash of lilac from the wrist of one of them. ACIA. Excuse me, said a quiet, polite voice, causing us to jump about 20 feet in the air. When we hit the ground again, I whirled around, but there was no one there. Sorry to startle you, the voice apologized, and I realized it was electronic, and coming from a tiny speaker set into the wall. It's just gone 7, the street computer continued, and I couldn't help but notice that only one of you is wearing the regulation black jacket for this period. I looked at Auckland, who was, of course, wearing the only jacket he had with him. He looked at me blankly, not even trying to come to terms with the sartorial hassle from an unseen computer. It's dark blue, I whispered. Won't that do? Dark blue and black are entirely different things. Black is the absence of colour, whereas blue, however intermixed with black it may be, retains a definite spectroscopy. What the fuck? Dark blue and black are entirely different things. Black is the absence of colour, whereas blue, however intermingled with black it may be, retains a definite spectroscopy. Look, I said, I live across the street from here. For reasons I'd prefer not to go into at this time, it would be great if we could just hang out here for a few moments, and then we're going to go in, okay? There was a pause. Promise? Yes. Okay, you have a 5-minute dispensation. Nice shirt, by the way. A tiny click signalled the end of the communication, and we waited for a couple of minutes. Auckland fretfully. And then the men reappeared, moving more slowly but still with urgency, which depressed me slightly. There had been a distant chance that the pseudo-flesh mess in the kitchen might have convinced them that the bomb had done its work and they could go home, but clearly that hadn't happened. The men stood in an intense haggle at the front of the lobby for a moment, and then vaulted back into the air cars. Moving at a moderate pace, one cruised down the street to our right, and the other went the other way. All 4 men carefully scrutinizing the pavements. We watched them go, and then I turned to Auckland and led him quietly down the alley. Okay, I said. Now we know which ways they're searching. So, what do? We go another way. Ah, he said, mollified. The only potential problem is if they've brought a tracer for your implant with them. Oh, what happens then? Plan B. Oh, which is? Unformed at this time, I muttered, speeding up a little. 5 minutes later, an alternate course of action was of rather more pressing interest. It was indeed the primary thing on my mind. Actually getting out of colour was not going to be difficult. It's not like stable. With my upwardly revised impression of how bloody-minded the centre was prepared to be, I realised that the monoports would now be staked out, and hoped that Zenda had made it out in time. Spangle would at least give her a legitimate excuse for being here, if not. For us, it didn't matter. The monoports are not the only way out. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that it looked as if the ACIA men had a tracer with them. We were about halfway to the edge of colour, scuttling quickly down the deserted streets, when I caught sight of one of the aircars a few blocks down. It was going the other way, but according to the direction they'd set off in, it shouldn't have been there at all. I took us down yet another alley, and this one was so narrow that it didn't even have a name, and we stopped. What? Auckland moaned. They're tracing you. The actioneer leant back against the wall, panting heavily. He looked pretty done in and resigned. He wasn't expecting to make it out, I realised. He glanced at me wearily. I take it Plan B is still in its embryonic stages? Uh-huh. Pre-fertilisation, in fact. I don't suppose your other lady friend, the one with the flying thing? No. Way too far away. Excuse me, said a voice, and Auckland shrank to the side, revealing a small matte black speaker set into the matte black wall. It is now 7:08. Your discretionary period has elapsed. Please go inside immediately. Christ, I said desperately. Give us a break, will you? I'm sorry, the voice said politely. It is out of my hands now. This is your final warning. Get indoors. Abruptly, I realised what Plan B was. We had to run like hell. I communicated this to Auckland, and we set off down the alley. At the end, we dashed across the street and across into another side road. I cast a glance sideways as we ducked into the shadows and saw exactly what I was hoping I wouldn't. About 2 blocks down, one of their air cars was turning our way. The tracer was homing in. I gave Auckland a shove and so nearly toppled him over that he had to run faster to prevent himself from falling flat on his face. Crude, but effective. You pick these things up. Side streets, black pavement, darkness. The light tapping of feet moving as quickly as they can, blurred lights, the rush of air, the ache of lungs that don't need this kind of shit. Why do I know this so well? Why do I spend so much of my time escaping from things? As we pelted across another street, the other air car turned into it, only 1 street away. A shout signalled the fact that they'd finally spotted us in the flesh. I took us 50 yards down the alley and then hung a left in the direction of the street the air car had come from. More chase psychology, but desperate stuff. They had an electronic device that remorselessly honed in on us. Breaking up patterns, doing the unexpected. That works when people have only got patterns to go on, but these guys had a little flashing light. We stopped 1 side street down from the main intersection. The annoying thing was that we were actually very close now. The edge of colour was only about 100 yards away. Across the intersection, down some steps, around a corner, and there was a gate, and beyond was sound. They could follow us there, sure, but only on foot, and on foot I could lose them. "Attention!" boomed an electronic voice from the wall. The polite suggestions were no more. The matter had been handed up the computer ladder. "The improperly dressed person must go indoors immediately." And then, marvellously, a siren went off to further ram home the street colour coordinator computer's displeasure. "Great!" wailed Auckland. The featureless black wall we were cowering against abruptly changed colour. Huge red arrows suddenly pointed down at us, flashing on and off. We walked quickly up to the intersection and onto the street, but the arrows followed us, as did the whooping siren. "Look!" I hissed, turning to the wall. "This is a guest, okay? He didn't know the regulations." "You did!" admonished the wall sternly and distressingly loudly. "You are aware of the importance of the colourless jacket period for allowing residents' hue appreciation faculties to rest?" "They're coming," said Auckland tonelessly. "I can hear them coming." "Look, Wall, there are some people chasing us." "I am aware of that. They are all properly dressed." "Yeah, but they're trying to kill us." "Nonsense." "Yes, they are." "Colour people," said the wall with imperious pride, "do not try to kill one another." "These aren't from colour. They're from the centre." There was a pause while the computer evaluated this claim. "Look at their wrists," I added plaintively. "Lilac cufflinks. They're ACIA." "I see," the wall said eventually, and more quietly. "Have you done anything wrong?" "No," I said, and there was a long pause. "Well, we can't have that then. Bloody can-do smart-asses." I was a bit surprised. I'd not realised that anti-actioneer sentiment ran quite so high amongst the neighbourhood's computers, but I was greatly relieved. The siren cut out, and the wall faded instantly to black. A block away, both aircars turned into the street, moving fast. "Step close to me," said the wall. Auckland was transfixed by the sight of the cars, now only 60 yards away. I grabbed him and pinned him up against the wall, and then stood close myself. The two cars drew slowly down the street towards us, driving abreast. In each car, the two ACI agents took one side of the street each, staring hard. "We're gonna die," opined the actioneer quietly. I didn't feel confident enough to contradict him. Not having a large and noisy sign pointing at us was a start, but I didn't see how it was going to tip the balance. Closer and closer the cars came, until I could see the tiny red flashing light on the dashboard of the one in front. It was flashing so rapidly that it was almost constantly lit. They must have known that they were virtually on top of us, and I couldn't understand why they couldn't see us. The cars stopped when they were exactly level with where we stood, flattened against the wall, and I held myself tensed, ready to go for my gun. I wouldn't have stood a chance, I knew, but what else can you do in situations like that? Yeah, exactly. So you go for your gun. The moment stretched, elongated, burst, and then, amazingly, the cars slowly started to move on. "Maybe they're in the street behind." "No way, look at the light, man." "Well, they're not here, are they?" "I guess not. Okay, take us round. Kinnip, do a U-turn and go round the other way." "Gotcha." The car in front cruised down to the end of the street, while the other rotated on the spot and zipped down to the corner. Alkland and I let out staggered breaths simultaneously, and I stepped away from the wall and looked at him. "How the—" I started, and then I saw. From 2 yards away I couldn't see Alkland. The street computer had turned the wall we'd been up against into a huge mural, a riot of pulsating colour. The swirl passing behind Alkland exactly matched the colour of his jacket. A long splash at head height was the same colour as his skin, except at the top, where it shaded into the grey of his hair. I took another step back, shaking my head. We'd been as good as invisible. "Wall," I said admiringly. "That was flash." "No problem," it said. "Now move." I took Alkland's arm and dragged him across the street. "Gosh," he said, staring back at the fading colours. We stumbled down the steps. At the bottom is a small dark courtyard, an old place. I'm a bit of a connoisseur for places like that. There aren't many like it in colour, or anywhere, in fact. Unchanged for hundreds of years and largely unvisited, it's like a path back to the past. Well, lyrical crap aside, it's also a path to sound. I got Alkland to take his clompy shoes off, told him not to make a sound until I said he could, and then we scampered off into the darkness. Flickering light, the soft hum of electrics turning and running, and the steady rocking warmth of movement, the quietness of a deserted public place at night, and the dryness of tired eyes. Through and past and over and through again, the outside is just a dark tunnel flecked with blurred smears of artificial light. I half sat and half lay on the mono's bristly seats, keeping half an eye on the fitfully sleeping actioneer, and half an eye on myself. We lost them. I don't know if they even made it into sound, if they realised that's where we went. I took a twisted path through the silent streets, doubling back, feigning, and then I left the neighbourhood at the least expected angle. Also, the angle that would take us where we were going. To muted colours and grey pebbles endlessly made cold by the ebb and flow of heavy water. Seagulls. Floating M's of noise against watercolour clouds and low diffused sunlight. To the coast, to the absolute graveyard of the past. The place where it was most clearly dead because it was still there and you could see how dead it was. As I sat wearily, too tired to sleep, my body warm with the carriage's heating and the back of my head cold against the window, I tried to take stock, to assimilate. The through mono would take us all the way there. We didn't have to change again. All we had to do was sit. And by morning we would be near the coast, near the next bit. All I had to do was sit and listen to my aching back. I thought about the recent days and trawled the hours for anything else I might have forgotten, anything that might be important. I came up with only 2 things. Someone had tried to get in touch with Sned, almost certainly to find out about Stable. It might be ACIA, it might not. Also, someone had tried to kill me at the stable wall. It might be ACIA, it might not. Okay, not rapier-like precision analysis, but it would have to do. When something starts, you have to take things at face value for a while because you don't have any reason to do otherwise. Catering for every eventuality all the time just slows you up. As time goes on, you get a context. You come to understand how the things are weighted and learn to predict and suspect more accurately. Things become less linear, more fragmented, and control becomes a fantasy. An all-important fantasy, but a fantasy all the same. I thought about Zenda, I knew she'd be able to play her part so long as things stayed under control. When they get out of control, though, there's nothing you can do but react, and I hoped that I'd be back by the time that happened. Maybe you think I haven't been too impressive so far, and perhaps you're right. I could defend myself, say it isn't easy, reacting all the time, running all the time, but I won't, because that's not the point. The point is too deep, too personal, and too small to explain. The point is not for spectators. Nothing that's important, really important, looks impressive, because it only means something to the person who does it. Staying alive, for example, and not dying, it looks so easy, but sometimes it's almost too difficult to be born. I thought about G, and Shelby, and Sned. Alone and awake in the cruising carriage, surrounded by night and sleep, I thought of them and I wished them well. I wrapped my thoughts up neatly, finished them, and put them to bed. I wanted them all in order, for sleep, as they say, can be very like death. It can be death itself, in fact. I was not going to sleep tonight. Someone had to watch over Auckland and wake him from such dreams as might come. Someone had to play hero and had to know that little bit more and had to be that tiny step ahead that keeps the story moving. And always, in my life, that someone is me. I'd like to sleep sometimes, watched over. I'd like to feel that someone guards my dreams and is there ready to touch my hand and help me. I'd like to be the one who reaches out to be comforted, to be loved. A child stretching for the embrace of a son it knows will ever be warm. But it can't be like that. Why? Well, you'll see, perhaps, if it's relevant. So, I wasn't going to sleep that night, or the next day. But, tomorrow, I would dream. Chapter 11. What you have to understand is that sometimes things are the way that they seem. By that, I don't mean that they aren't the way they might be thought to be beneath what you see, necessarily. What I mean is that, Christ, I'll start this again. Sometimes things are not the way they seem. You look at something and it seems straightforward and you think that you understand it, and it's only later that you realize that the truth is different. Okay. No prizes for observation so far. Sometimes, on the other hand, you look at something and you know already it's not the way it seems. You know because you understand what you're seeing. You're aware of the context and you realize that appearances are being deceptive. But sometimes, and these are the important sometimes, that's wrong. Sometimes when you think you're being deceived, you're not. Sometimes things are the way they look, however surprising that may be, and sometimes that can make all the difference in the world. Let me put it another way. Why does a journey always seem quicker when you're coming back? At 8 o'clock the next morning, we were standing on front of East Edge neighbourhood, looking out onto the sea. There was no one around, no one but a few wheeling seabirds and us, and no sound apart from the gentle crash of waves and, in the distance, someone playing a piano. Auckland flipped out. I've come here quite often down the years, and sometimes because I had to, like today. More often, just to be here. I've seen the sea before. I've really seen it. I've stood in front of it and come to terms with it. Vast, dark, heaving bastard that it is. Auckland hadn't. Like most people these days, he knew it existed. He knew what its chemical properties were, but as to what it was, It's very big, isn't it? He said eventually. I nodded. I don't know why, but I find it difficult to talk properly in front of the sea. It makes me go all epigrammatic and oblique. It's partly being an East Edge that does that too. As we walked slowly across the front, the strong breeze wrapping our clothes round the front of our bodies, I saw that the neighbourhood had changed not at all since last I'd been there. It looks like a ghost town, which is what it is. East Edge is big, covering about 50 miles of coastland, yet only about 20 people live here. No one comes here. They haven't been in over 100 years. We've turned our back on the sea, turned our back on that huge churning storm of uncertainty. We don't need it anymore. We have no use for it. The buildings along the front are still in a reasonable state of repair because nobody has the energy to come this far to vandalise a dead town. What would be the point? The shops and the restaurants, genteel crumbling hotels and rotting jetties, they wait out the decades by themselves, watching the tides and the passing years, left well behind in time with nothing but dissolution in front of them. They are the fading palaces of yesterday's world. Whew, see what I mean? Okay, I'll try and snap out of it. It's a bit spooky, actually, Auckland said, dragging his eyes away from the sea to take in the peeling storefronts and the windswept, deserted street. Doesn't anybody live here anymore? A very few do. Mild cranks and lunatics for the most part. We're going to go and visit one of them now. Are we? The auctioneer sounded dubious. Why? And where's that piano coming from? We were getting closer to the source of the music. It was actually rather beautiful in an eerie way. Small fragments of a melody of calm melancholy. As we passed one of the bigger restaurants on the other side of the street, I thought I saw a flicker of movement deep within, but I didn't go to check. The people here are easily frightened, and I like the music. We're going to go and visit this guy because he's got a plane. Ah, I wondered why we'd come all this way. After an untroubled night's sleep, the auctioneer didn't look any healthier, but he certainly seemed more chipper in a tired sort of way. Are we, leaving the country or something? Yeah, I said. And no. We're not going to go in the plane. He is. Ah, I see, he replied. But then he frowned. No, I don't. What are we doing then? Staying here. What? I knew that sooner or later I was going to have to try to explain the next bit to Auckland, but I wanted to hold off for the time being. If he didn't have much time to think about it, it would be easier for me, or less unbelievably difficult anyway. Just trust me, I said. He replied, but then he left it at that. 2 hours later, we were sitting in the Dome. The Dome used to be the big hotel on the Strip, the place where you came if you had a tremendous amount of money and wanted to make that fact absolutely clear to everybody else. Short of carrying a large sign, the best way of saying, "Hey, look, I have more cash than I probably know what to do with," was to check into the Dome for a couple of weeks. But rich people have become very serious, it seems, and now those people are hanging out in Branfield and Cash neighbourhoods playing golf. Being rich doesn't look like as much fun as it used to be. In the old days, you got rich and then you stopped working and concentrated very hard on having a very good time in very expensive ways. Now people get rich and then they just work harder to become even richer. Sometimes they play golf. That's it, apparently. Doesn't sound like a bundle of laughs to me, but there you are. We were sitting in the Dome's dining room, which is a room about 100 metres square, still littered with the occasional chair and table amidst the dust and debris. The room is at the centre of the hotel and has no windows, and that's important. Finding Villig had been easy. He lives in a kind of one-man shanty town on the beach. He started off in the old changing hut there, but over the years he added lean-tos and extensions and bits and pieces, and now it covers the beach from road to sea in a strip about 20 yards wide. For reasons known only to himself, and probably not even to him, Villig has built his house in such a way that the roof is only about 4 feet off the ground. Inside is a series of chambers and tunnels and dens, and you have to get around by crawling on your hands and knees. Leaving the actioneer outside, to his relief, I found one of the several entrances and burrowed in towards the centre. It took a while to find him, but Villig was in. He's always in. If I didn't come and stir up his nest with a stick every now and again, he would probably have taken root by now. Once I'd found him, I crawled towards what serves as a kitchen and made a pot of Yavahan's stupidly high-strength coffee. Don't ever drink that stuff, by the way. It makes foolish and unhelpful thoughts feel like a state of transcendental bliss. Drinking Yavahan's stupidly high strength makes you realise why alcoholics drink so much. It's only in Villig's kitchen because I put it there. Fashioning a rough funnel out of cardboard, I tipped the stuff down Villig's throat until he was a functioning human being, and then I hustled him out of a tunnel into the outside world. Auckland was down at the waterline, staring benignly out at the massive expanse of blue, letting the water lap up close to his shoes, watching the waves and smelling the salt. "Wow," Villig said on re-entry. "It's all still here. The sky, the earth, all that stuff. Cool. And there's no snakes." Auckland joined us, regarding Villig with some caution. The fact that Villig dresses in rags and has hair down to his waist tends not to inspire confidence, and I don't think Auckland has ever met a card-carrying loony before. Villig gazed vaguely back at the actioneer for a while, and then turned and punched me on the shoulder. "So, Stark, eh? Huh? Huh?" He stopped, laboriously backtracked in his mind for the point that his sentence was supposed to be, found it, and then continued. "Oh, back into the fray, eh? Back into the Twilight Zone. Am I right, huh?" And then he giggled for quite some time. Auckland raised his eyebrows at me, and I shrugged. Villig is a complete disaster of a human being in all but one respect. There's one thing that he's uniquely qualified to do, and I needed him to do it now. "Vil," I said, waving a hand in front of his face to attract his attention, "I need to go soon." "Uh-huh," he grunted, and then he whirled around to look at Auckland again, who flinched. "This the gentleman? This the plaintiff?" "Yeah," I said. "He'll be going too." "Yeah, right on." Villig peered closely at the actioneer's face for a while. Been having some bad dreams, hey?" Auckland stared at him, startled. How do you know that?" "I can see it in your face, man. It's written all over." Auckland turned to me, realizing, for the first time I suspect, that there might be a little more to his sleeping problems than he'd realised. That was good. That was the reason I'd brought him to meet Villig rather than leave him to his own devices while I sorted things out. "Okay," said Villig abruptly. He shut his eyes tight for a long moment and then reopened them. Although still bloodshot, they looked suddenly intelligent, the blue still piercing despite his best efforts to extinguish it. He looked at his wrist and then tutted because there was no watch there and asked me the time. "Right," he said. "Right, yep. Gimme an hour." He nodded at Auckland, who, surprised by his new note of authority, nodded back. And then he strode off down the beach. We watched him go for a moment, and then Auckland spoke. "Stark," he said, you have some very odd friends." And now we were sitting at a table and surrounded by faded grandeur. I tried to explain to him what was going to happen next. "You see, what it is this. Things are sometimes the way they appear. That's the bottom line, the concentrated version, but you'll have to add it to one other fact before you see where I'm going. Imagine a road you know well, the one where your apartment is on, or the road to the store or something like that. Now picture yourself walking down it. Think about the buildings, the trees if there are any, the cracks in the pavement, and the way that the journey looks and feels. Done that? Okay. Now do the same, but coming up the road. Feels different, doesn't it? I don't just mean the obvious way. The road you're walking up or down feels actually different. It seems like a different road. I mean, sure, you know it's the same, but how does it actually look? How does it feel? Does it feel like you're walking up and down the same road, or does it feel a little bit like you're walking the same way down different roads? You may have noticed this before. Noticed that if you go a different way down a road you use all the time, you might not recognize it. You might have noticed that the journey back from somewhere always seems quicker than the journey out, even if you go the same way. Okay, so what, you're saying? Perception, psychology, subjectivity. What difference? That's the point. It isn't perception, psychology, or subjectivity. Roads are different depending which way you go down them. That's really the way it is. Not a lot of people realize that. They're not equipped to see it and believe it. The fact that Villig does is why he can do what he does. And the fact that I do is one of the reasons that I'm so good at what I do. It's a hell of a difficult thing to come to terms with, but that's the way it is. And once you realize that, the gates are thrown wide open. "All right," said Auckland eventually. "All right," said Auckland eventually. "All right, okay. Even if I do accept that intellectually, as a conceptual position, what difference does it make? And what does it have to do with us being here and with that odd man?" I lit another cigarette. The last half hour had been very heavy going. As I expected, the can-do, rational, reality is what it seems actioneer had put up a long and rigorous fight against what I'd just tried to explain, and he still wasn't buying it. I wouldn't care, but he had to be convinced, or at least ready to believe. Without that, this wasn't going to work. "You've never been in a plane, have you?" I asked by way of preparation. "Or, flown to a different country?" "No, of course I haven't." "Right," I said and rubbed my forehead. Well, you're going to have to take my word for this next bit then. People generally do have to. Nobody goes abroad these days anymore. No more than they wander around seeing different neighbourhoods. Well, I started, and then I changed my mind abruptly. He wasn't going to believe what I was going to tell him. He simply wasn't built to intuitively take on board what some guy on a plane had realised a few 100 years back and what it meant. I was just going to have to hope that my belief and my knowledge was enough to carry us both. It generally was, but I sensed that Alkland was going to be a heavy load. Never mind. The point is this. You and I are going to walk out of this hotel, walk down to the beach, and then we're going to keep on walking for a couple of miles. Into the sea? Laughed Alkland. Yep, I said. His face changed, and for the first time I saw how he'd got as high up in the centre as he had. Look, Stark, this is not a time for joking. You know I can't swim, and unless you're planning that we walk on water... No, you look, I said irritably. I was tired, and I was a little fed up at this point by continually having to wade through layers of rationality to say what I had to say. We're not going to swim. We're going to walk. I don't expect you to understand that, but you have to keep an open mind. You have to trust that I know what I'm doing. So do you? I don't know. Let me put it to you in a way I know you'll understand. Okay? Delegation. Division of responsibility, yeah? You don't do everything in your department. You don't do all the jobs. Sometimes you have to let better qualified people do bits of it, okay? Yeah, okay, he conceded grudgingly. Actioneers are like that. The fact that they can't do absolutely everything themselves pisses them off to no end. When it comes to this, I'm not just the better qualified person, I'm the only qualified person. That's why Zenda gets me in. That's why I'm here. I'm the only person who can do this. I can probably do it without your trust, but it's going to make it a hell of a lot more difficult for both of us, especially you. Alkland was silent for a moment, and then his face softened. Okay, I'm sorry, Stark. I just don't know what to think, what to do. I'm not used to this kind of thing. I'm not used to uncertainty. I know. I am. It's my job. My whole life is one whole, what next? I'm forever using plan B or C or Z. That's the way these things work, Alkland. Life is not a memo, okay? It's strange and it can turn on you, and it does what you least expect it to all the fucking time. There are more things in heaven and earth, Alkland, and I'm about to show you one of them, okay? Suddenly he smiled, with a what-the-hell grin that took 30 years off him. Okay. What do I do? We walk out of here. Things are going to be different outside. Spend the next 5 minutes thinking about that. Things are going to be different and strange, but what you see is what there is, okay? And trust me. I do, he said. God knows why, but I do. Well, he must have done. Enough, at least. 5 minutes later, I felt a very small tickle at the back of my mind, and I knew it was time to go. I stood up, and Alkland rose with me. The actioneer had spent the last few minutes deep in thought, turned in on himself, obviously trying as best as he could to internalize what I'd said to him. He looked at me nervously. Is it working? Whatever it is? Yep. I knew it was because I could feel it. It's difficult to describe, but everything looks and feels more intense. Colours stand out the way they do before a storm, and you seem to see everything very clearly in a rather peculiar way. It's a bit like being drunk, but staying absolutely stone-cold sober at the same time. Maybe Alkland had actually begun to believe what I'd told him. Maybe seeing Villig had given him a sense that something genuinely weird was in the offing. Whatever. It was working. So far. I led the actioneer out of the dining room and through into the foyer, and we paused for a moment in front of the huge wooden doors. "Are you ready for this?" "I suppose so," he said dubiously. "What should I expect?" "What you see. Nothing else." He nodded, and I swung the door open, and we stepped out. The bright early morning sun was gone, and in its place was a ceiling of low, unbroken grey cloud that made the world seem like a limitless room on a winter afternoon. Occasional pockets of wind rocketed down the street as we crossed to the promenade, whipping leaves and old newspapers around us and howling through doorways and then disappearing. A dustbin lid blew off and wheeled across the road, clanking, although where we were was still. The piano was silent because the pianist wasn't here anymore. Now, no one was here except for us. When we reached the promenade, I stopped and let Alkland take it in. The beach was different, as it always is. Instead of being yellow, it was now mid-grey and wet-looking, as if packed down by decades of rain. It wasn't sand at all anymore, but a kind of heavy mud, and there was something else. "Where's the sea gone?" Alkland wailed, clinging onto the rail. "Where's the bloody sea?" The ocean had disappeared, and in its place the dark beach stretched out as far as the horizon. The first 50 yards were featureless, but then it reared and undulated in small ridges and hillocks, stretching out to the horizon, stretching for hundreds, thousands of miles. The way was open. A long, long time ago, back when people still travelled between countries fairly regularly, there was this guy on a plane. The man, whose name was Kratz, was bored, whiling away the hours, and for want of anything better to do, he leant over and looked out of the window. The plane was over the ocean at the time, way high up, and he looked out and was struck by what he saw. It looked as though they were flying over some weird, limitless mudflat, a featureless expanse of grey mottled by dips and low ridges. He knew they weren't, of course. He knew that it was just the ocean, but the longer he stared down, the harder it became to believe. He knew that the ridges and dips were actually waves frozen into apparent motionlessness by the height, and that their colour was dark metallic blue, but from up there it didn't look like that. It looked like a plane. Then he fell asleep, which is kind of unromantic, but there you go. And he forgot about the whole thing until he was flying home again, when he remembered. He looked out of the window, and there it was again, the ocean, but looking like this strange, featureless expanse. He stared out at it for hours, and was unable to tear his eyes away. When he got home, he told a friend about it, and tried to explain how weird the sensation was, how it felt that if it were possible to drop a rope ladder down from the plane and clamber down the 30,000 feet to the bottom, you wouldn't drop into water, but you would step out onto this strange dark plane. By chance, this friend had an imagination as strong as his, and, as she was in love with him at the time, was ready to take such an odd observation more seriously than it deserved. Kratz lived by the sea, and they walked up and down the beach the evening he got back, speculating wildly and increasingly drunkenly about it in the way that lovers do. Then they went to bed and forgot all about it, as lovers also do. That's actually a strange feature of this whole thing. It's very easy to forget about. For a while you have a clear and urgent sensation of understanding, and then suddenly it's gone, and you'll be groping around in your mind, trying to remember what it was that you thought you'd known. I remember it always, but that's very unusual. There's only about 5 people who know about this in the whole world. Anyway, a couple of months later, Kratz's friend had to take the same flight herself, and about 4 hours into the flight she glanced out of the window and remembered the previous conversation immediately, because Kratz had been right. It really did look like a plane. This is where the coincidence comes in. It's kind of a big one, but you're just going to have to accept it, because this is what happened. At the moment that Kratz's friend was looking out of the window, Kratz himself was in a store on the seafront. Suddenly he felt a strange sensation at the back of his mind, like a kind of tickling. He thought that some acquaintance had snuck up behind him, so he turned around and he saw what Alkland was seeing now. The sea had disappeared. He wandered out of the shop, mouth hanging open, and walked across the road to the beach. The ocean had fully, really gone, and what was left was what he'd seen from the plane, a measureless expanse of something beneath a low, storm-like sky. Not even noticing that the beach and promenade were deserted, that all the summer tourists who'd been milling about when he'd walked to the store had vanished, he vaulted over the wall and went down to the beach. He walked out onto the plain, and he walked, and he found what he found. Accounts differ as to what actually happened, but that doesn't matter. The important thing was that the way was opened. A gate that nobody even knew existed had suddenly swung wide. 6 hours later, Kratz woke up to find himself in his living room on the sofa. He felt exhausted and thirsty and staggered into the kitchen to get some milk. On the way, he remembered his dreams suddenly, and with shocking clarity. Oh, what a shame it wasn't true, he thought as he drank his milk, that the ocean hadn't disappeared and that he'd just fallen asleep on the sofa. What a shame. That would have been interesting. Then he noticed that his shoes were covered in dark grey mud, and that he'd left tracks into the kitchen from the living room. He followed them back into there and found something very strange. The prints started at the sofa. That's how all this started. I explained this to Alkland as we stood looking out onto the plain, our coats whirled around us by the strange occasional crashes of wind that seemed to be part of the whole thing. I explained that Willig was up there now, high above the earth in his plane, looking down at the ocean and seeing it the way we were. That I'd needed him up there to be able to take Alkland in. I explained once that sometimes things are the way they appear, and if you know that, the world becomes a different place. The actioneer just stood there, mouth open, shaking his head in mild rejection of everything he could see. But he didn't reject it. Not really. If he had, we wouldn't have been seeing what he was seeing, and he couldn't reject it. Not with me standing there. I'm a very strong dreamer, you see. What happens now? He asked eventually, looking up at me earnestly like an elderly child. Now, we walk. We took the steps down to the beach. Alkland hesitated for quite a while before actually setting a foot on it, as if frightened that the plane might just be an illusion, that his foot would slip right through and he'd fall into God knows where. I didn't hurry him. I knew that he was having to take quite a lot on board at the moment, and that his current state of acquiescence was fragile. Steps that you take by yourself are much stronger. If you push someone, they'll fall, but if you can get them to jump by themselves, then they might just land safely. In the end, he took the step, and I followed him onto the plane. How far do we have to go? Varies. Probably a mile or two. The going's a bit, soft, isn't it? He muttered, peering down at the mud. Is it gonna rain? Nah. Clouds always look like that here. Why? I don't know. That's just the way it is. He nodded. Righto. And then we walked. It was absolutely silent out there on the plain. The only sound was the faint squelching of our feet in the mud. The surface wasn't too bad, actually. I've seen times when the mud is ankle deep and vile, but this was relatively solid. Within 10 minutes we left the flat area behind, and we were weaving our way amidst the low ridges and occasional small dips that ruffled the surface. For a long time we walked without speaking. Auckland was trudging by my side, sometimes glancing back the way we'd come, sometimes looking over the terrain with an air of slightly grumpy puzzlement. I'm accepting this for now, that demeanour said, but I don't like it. If you want to be mud rather than sea, fine. Just don't you dare do anything else, like change colour or anything. I'm watching you. After about an hour, the ridges started to get a little higher, some as much as 4 or 5 feet, and the dips were deeper. I led us through them, following the middle ground, our course shaped and altered by the random undulations. Is this a path? Yes and no. No, because it's different every time, so there can't really be a path. Yes, because it's leading us where we're going. I see. Auckland glared at the ridge we were passing, as if feeling that this qualified as the additional strange thing he'd been warned about. If I asked you where we're going, would I regret it? No, I said. Probably not. Would I understand it? Not at first. You'll see when we get there. You've been there before. I have. Yep. My life, the actioneer said wistfully, has become very strange recently. In the pale light, his face looked tired and drawn, with unhealthy-looking patches of colour. You should try mine, I smiled at him. No, thank you, he said with some force. No, thank you indeed. Half an hour later, I saw that we were getting close. The ridges were bending in a certain way, a way that I've learned to recognise. Then a turn took us into a sort of tiny valley, wide enough for 4 people to walk abreast, with the sides just over our heads. It was a dead end, and I knew that we were there. What now? Well, have you ever had a general anaesthetic? I asked. Yeah, he replied. I had 4 wisdom teeth out. Why? Because this is what it's going to be like. You know when they put the butterfly into your hand and inject the drug? The way that it feels very cold for a moment, and cold and heavy and clear? That's what this feels like. Stark, he said, turning to look at me. I'm afraid. Don't be. It's okay. It'll be all right. There's no need to be afraid. At least, not yet, anyway. He didn't look very reassured. Don't worry about what happens next. I'm going to find you, okay? I will be there. A deep breath shuddered out of him. Okay. We carried on walking steadily, straight towards the dead end. About 5 yards away, Auckland timidly took my hand, and I held it. Another few steps and the feeling cut in, cruel sharpness and a heavy chill that seemed to soak right through your body. I gripped the actioneer's hand tightly and kept going. Stark! Sweet dreams, I said.